My therapist shared my suicide attempt at his book launch, and I shared his patient files at his licensing hearing. I was standing in the back of the bookstore trying not to hyperventilate when Dr. Nathan Reeves told a room full of strangers about the night I swallowed 40 sleeping pills and woke up in the ICU with a tube down my throat. He said, I had a patient once who was so desperate for attention that he staged an elaborate suicide attempt, took just enough pills to be saved, and then spent weeks milking the sympathy from everyone around him. The audience laughed. Someone in the front row nodded knowingly. My coworker Linda was sitting 3 rows from the stage, and she turned around and scanned the crowd, and I knew she was looking for me because I'd told her 6 months ago during a breakdown in the office bathroom that I'd tried to kill myself. She was the only person at work who knew. I watched her face change when she put it together. Dr. Reeves kept talking about manipulation and attention-seeking behavior and how some patients use crisis as currency. He said, this particular patient had a pattern of creating emergencies whenever he felt ignored. Classic borderline traits, no real desire to die, just a desperate need to be seen. I left before he could finish the story. I walked out of that bookstore and sat in my car for 20 minutes with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I'd been seeing Dr. Reeves for 3 years. I'd trusted him with everything. The pills weren't a cry for attention. They were what happened when you spent 6 months planning your exit and finally worked up the courage to go through with it. I'd written letters to my parents and my sister. I'd paid off my credit cards. I'd cleaned my apartment so no one would have to deal with the mess. I'd taken those pills because I genuinely believed the world would be better without me in it. The next morning I called his office and his receptionist Diane said, Dr. Reeves is booked solid for the next 3 weeks. Can I schedule you for November? I said, I need to speak with him today. It's urgent. She put me on hold for 5 minutes and came back and said, he has 15 minutes at 4:30 if you can make that work. I showed up at 4:15 and sat in the waiting room staring at the motivational posters on the walls. There was one with a sunset that said, every day is a new beginning, and I thought about how Dr. Reeves had turned my worst day into an anecdote for his book tour. He opened his office door at 4:35 and smiled and said, David, come on in. I heard you wanted to talk. I sat down in the chair I'd sat in every Tuesday for 3 years and said, you told my story at your book launch. You talked about my suicide attempt in front of 200 people. His smile didn't change. He sat down across from me and said, I don't discuss specific patients in public forums. Everything I share is carefully anonymized and composited from multiple cases. That's standard practice. I said, you described the exact number of pills I took. You mentioned the ICU. You called it attention-seeking behavior. He tilted his head and said, David, I think you might be projecting here. The case study I presented was drawn from several different patients over the course of my career. If you're identifying with that narrative, we should explore why you're feeling so defensive about it. I stared at him and felt something cold settle in my chest. He was gaslighting me. He was sitting there looking concerned and compassionate and telling me I'd imagined the whole thing. I said, my coworker was there. She recognized the story. She knows it was about me. Dr. Reeves leaned forward and said, Linda was at the event? I nodded. He sighed and pulled out his notebook and started writing. This is concerning, David. You're making connections that don't exist, and you're worried about what people think. That's the anxiety talking. Have you been taking your medication? I said, this isn't about anxiety. You violated confidentiality. He set down his pen and looked at me with that expression he used when he thought I was being irrational. I did no such thing, but I am worried about your mental state right now. You seem agitated and paranoid. Those are red flags. I think we need to talk about adjusting your treatment plan. I felt the walls closing in. He was doing it again, taking my legitimate concern and turning it into evidence of my instability, making me question my own perception of reality. I stood up and said, I'm done. I'm finding a new therapist. He stood too and said, David, please sit down. Walking out in the middle of a session is exactly the kind of impulsive behavior we've been working on. Let's talk this through. I opened the door and he said, if you leave now, I'll have to document this episode. It could affect your treatment record. I left anyway. I walked out of his office and past Diane, who was staring at her computer screen, and out to the parking lot where I sat in my car and tried to figure out what had just happened. He'd threatened me. He'd told me that leaving would go in my file as evidence of instability. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he'd said at the book launch, how he'd described my suicide attempt as manipulation, how the audience had laughed, how Linda had looked at me differently when I came back to work the next week. She'd stopped asking me to lunch. She'd stopped making small talk by the coffee maker. She'd started treating me with careful distance, the way people treated fragile things they were afraid might break. On Friday, she knocked on my office door and said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Sure." She came in and closed the door and sat down and said, "I was at Dr. Reeves's event on Wednesday. I heard the story he told about the patient who took pills for attention. That was you, wasn't it?" I didn't answer. She said, "David, I'm not judging. I just want to understand. When you told me about what happened, you made it sound like you were really trying to die. But if Dr. Reeves is saying it was for attention, I'm confused about what actually happened." I said, "It wasn't for attention. I really wanted to die. She looked uncomfortable and said, "But he's your therapist. He would know better than anyone what your intentions were, right? And he seemed pretty clear that it was a manipulation tactic." I felt something snap inside me. He violated my confidentiality. He shared private medical information in a public setting. That's illegal. Linda shifted in her seat and said, "He didn't use your name, though, and he's a professional. I'm sure he knows what he can and can't share. Maybe you're misinterpreting what he said." I spent the weekend researching HIPAA violations and patient confidentiality laws. I found a lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice and made an appointment for Monday afternoon. Her name was Rebecca Foster, and she had 20 years of experience and a wall full of plaques documenting her victories. I sat in her office and told her everything. The book launch, the story, the way my coworker had put the pieces together, the conversation in Dr. Reeves's office where he'd threatened to document my reaction. Rebecca listened and took notes, and when I finished, she said, "Do you have any proof that he was talking about you specifically?" I said, "He described my exact situation. The number of pills, the ICU, the timing." She said, "But did he use your name or any identifying information?" I said, "No, but my coworker recognized it." Rebecca set down her pen and said, "Here's the problem. Unless he used your name or enough specific details that a reasonable person could identify you, it's going to be very difficult to prove a HIPAA violation. Therapists are allowed to discuss case studies as long as they anonymize them. The fact that your coworker made the connection doesn't necessarily mean he violated the law." I said, "So he can tell my story to anyone he wants, as long as he doesn't say my name?" She said, "Essentially, yes, as long as he's careful about the details." I felt the air go out of me. There has to be something I can do. Rebecca looked at me sympathetically and said, "You could file a complaint with the state licensing board. They investigate ethical violations even if they don't rise to the level of illegal conduct. But I have to warn you, those investigations take months, and the burden of proof is on you." I filed the complaint on Wednesday. I filled out a 12-page form detailing what had happened and submitted it with copies of my treatment records showing the dates of my hospitalization and the session notes where Dr. Reeves had documented my suicide attempt. 3 weeks later, I got a letter saying the board had received my complaint and assigned it to an investigator. It said the process could take 6 to 18 months depending on the complexity of the case. In the meantime, Dr. Reeves's book hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was called The Architecture of Attention: Understanding Manipulation in Modern Therapy, and it was everywhere. Morning shows, podcasts, magazine profiles. He was being called a revolutionary voice in mental health treatment, a pioneer who wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking about patient behavior. I saw him on Good Morning America talking about how therapists needed to stop enabling manipulation and start holding patients accountable. The host asked him about the most extreme case he'd encountered, and he said, "I had a patient who staged a suicide attempt with such precision that it was clear he'd calculated exactly how many pills would get him hospitalized, but not killed. He wanted the experience of being saved without the risk of actually dying. That's not mental illness. That's performance art." I watched the interview from my office and felt sick. He was doing it again, telling my story to millions of people, framing my worst moment as calculated manipulation. My boss called me into his office that afternoon. His name was Richard Coleman, and he'd been with the company for 30 years, and he had photos of his grandchildren all over his desk. He said, "David, we need to talk about your performance lately. You've been distracted, you've missed 2 deadlines, and I've had concerns raised about your mental state." I said, "Who raised concerns?" He looked uncomfortable and said, "That's confidential. But I want you to know that we value you as an employee, and we want to support you through whatever you're going through. I think it might be helpful if you took some personal time. Maybe saw someone professionally." I said, "I have been seeing someone professionally. That's part of the problem." Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm going to be direct with you. There's been talk around the office that you might be unstable, that you've had some mental health crises in the past, and that you're not handling stress well. I need to know if you're a liability to this company." I felt my face get hot. "Who's been talking about my mental health?" He said, "I can't reveal my sources, but I think you should take 2 weeks off and get yourself sorted out. Come back when you're in a better place." I left his office and went straight to HR and demanded to know who had been discussing my medical history. The HR director was a woman named Patricia Vance, and she had a master's degree in organizational psychology and a framed certificate on her wall about workplace discrimination. She said, "I can't disclose internal communications, but I can tell you that we take employee well-being very seriously. If there are concerns about your mental stability, we have an obligation to address them." I went home and called my sister Emma. She was a lawyer in Chicago, and she'd always been good at cutting through emotional noise and getting to the practical solutions. I told her everything, and she was quiet for a long time and then said, "He's destroying your reputation. This isn't just about confidentiality anymore. He's actively sabotaging your life." I said, "What am I supposed to do? The licensing board complaint is going to take forever, and even if they find he did something wrong, what's the punishment? A slap on the wrist?" Emma said, "You need evidence, real evidence, not just your word against his. You need to prove he's violated ethics with other patients too. One complaint looks personal. Multiple complaints looks like a pattern. I said, how am I supposed to get that? She said, you said he has 15 years of practice. He must have hundreds of former patients. Some of them probably have similar stories. You need to find them. That night, I started searching. I found his LinkedIn profile and scrolled through his connections looking for people who might have been patients. I found his practice's Facebook page and looked through the reviews. Most were glowing. Dr. Reeves changed my life. Best therapist I've ever had. I owe him everything. But there were a few that stood out. One from a woman named Jessica Lane who'd left 1 star and written, violated my trust in ways I can't describe. Would not recommend. Another from someone named Andrew Carter who wrote, be careful what you share with this man. He sees patients as content, not people. I sent them both private messages explaining who I was and what had happened. Jessica responded within an hour. She said, he did the same thing to me, used my story in a journal article without my permission. Changed a few details, but anyone who knew me would have recognized it. When I confronted him, he told me I was being paranoid. I asked if she'd filed a complaint, and she said she'd tried, but gave up when the investigator told her it was hard to prove without more evidence. Andrew responded the next day. He said Dr. Reeves had shared details about his addiction recovery at a conference on substance abuse. He said he'd been sitting in the audience at his company's mandatory training and heard his therapist describe his relapses and his arrests and his failed relationships. He said 3 of his coworkers had approached him afterwards to ask if he was okay. He said he'd quit his job 2 weeks later because he couldn't face them anymore. I asked both of them if they'd be willing to file complaints with the licensing board or testify if it came to that. Jessica said yes immediately. Andrew said he'd think about it, but he was afraid of making things worse. Over the next month, I found 6 more people who had similar stories. Dr. Reeves had a pattern. He'd build trust with vulnerable patients, extract their most painful experiences, and then repackage those experiences as teaching moments for his growing platform. He'd speak at conferences and write articles and give interviews, and every time he needed a compelling example, he'd reach into his patient files and pull out someone's trauma. The licensing board investigator called me in December. Her name was Susan Graham, and she sounded tired on the phone. She said, I've reviewed your complaint and I need to ask you some follow-up questions. Can you come to the office next week? I drove 2 hours to the state capitol and sat in a windowless conference room while Susan asked me to walk through everything again. I showed her the other complaints I'd collected. I showed her the patterns. I showed her the timeline of when Dr. Reeves had shared each story and when his career had taken off. Susan wrote everything down and said, this is helpful, but I need you to understand that proving an ethics violation is difficult. He's careful about anonymizing details, and he has an expensive lawyer who will argue that everything he did falls within acceptable professional boundaries. I said, so he's going to get away with it. She said, I didn't say that. I said it's difficult, but if you're patient and if we can get the other victims to cooperate, we might have a case. I left that meeting feeling hollowed out. It had been 4 months since the book launch and Dr. Reeves was more successful than ever. He'd been invited to speak at a psychiatry conference in Boston. He was consulting for a TV show about therapy. He was doing a podcast tour talking about his book. Meanwhile, I was on antidepressants I could barely afford, going to a new therapist who spent most of our sessions helping me process the betrayal from my old therapist, and watching my career implode because people thought I was unstable. Linda stopped speaking to me entirely after Thanksgiving. I'd see her in the hallway and she'd look away. I'd pass her in the parking lot and she'd pretend to be on her phone. In January, she went to Richard and told him she felt unsafe working near me. She said I'd been giving her threatening looks and she was afraid I might become violent. Richard called me into his office and said, this is serious, David. Linda has made a formal complaint about your behavior. She says you've been intimidating her. I said, that's insane. I haven't said anything to her. I've barely seen her. He said, she feels threatened. That's what matters. I'm going to have to move your office to the East Building, and I need you to agree to stay away from her. If there's any contact, I'll have no choice but to let you go. I signed the agreement because I couldn't afford to lose my job. I spent the next 2 months working alone in a converted storage room with no windows and eating lunch in my car because the break room was in the main building where Linda worked. Every morning I woke up and thought about Dr. Reeves sleeping in whatever expensive hotel he was staying at for his latest speaking engagement. I thought about him telling more stories about desperate, manipulative patients who staged crises for attention. I thought about how many other people were sitting in audiences right now, hearing their trauma repackaged as entertainment. In March, Susan called and said the investigation was complete. She said the board had found sufficient evidence to bring formal charges against Dr. Reeves for ethical violations. She said there would be a hearing in May where he would have the opportunity to respond to the allegations, and I would have the opportunity to testify. She said, I want you to be prepared for this. He's going to have lawyers. They're going to attack your credibility. They're going to bring up your mental health history, and they're going to argue that you're an unreliable witness who's holding a grudge. I said, I know. She said, the hearing will be open to the public. Anyone can attend. It will be recorded, and the transcripts will be part of the public record. Are you prepared for that? I said, yes. What I didn't say was that I'd been waiting for this moment for 6 months. I'd been documenting everything. I'd been collecting evidence, and I'd been planning exactly what I was going to do when I finally got Dr. Reeves in a room where he couldn't control the narrative. The hearing was scheduled for May 14th at 9 a.m. in the administrative building downtown. I showed up at 8:30 with a folder full of documents and a USB drive containing every piece of evidence I'd collected. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. There was a long table at the front where 5 board members sat looking serious and official. There was a table for Dr. Reeves and his lawyers on the right side. There was a table for me on the left. And there were about 30 chairs in the back for observers. Dr. Reeves walked in at 8:50 wearing an expensive suit and looking calm. He nodded at the board members and shook hands with his lawyers and didn't look at me once. The hearing started with opening statements. The board's attorney laid out the charges: multiple violations of patient confidentiality, misuse of patient information for personal gain, failure to maintain appropriate boundaries between clinical practice and public platform. Dr. Reeves' attorney stood up and said his client had done nothing wrong. He said Dr. Reeves was a respected professional who had helped countless patients and contributed significantly to the field of psychology. He said the complaints were coming from disgruntled former patients who had unrealistic expectations and poor outcomes. He said this was a witch hunt motivated by jealousy of Dr. Reeves' success. Then it was time for testimony. I went first. I walked through everything: the book launch, the story about the pills, the way my coworker had recognized it, the conversation in Dr. Reeves' office where he'd threatened to document my reaction as instability. I presented the timeline showing how he'd used my case and 6 others to build his platform. I showed how every major career milestone had coincided with him sharing patient stories at conferences or in publications. Dr. Reeves' lawyer cross-examined me for 90 minutes. He asked about my mental health history. He asked about the medications I was taking. He asked if I'd ever been hospitalized before the suicide attempt. He asked if I had a history of conflicts with authority figures. He asked if I'd been fired from previous jobs. He said, "Isn't it true that you've struggled with paranoid thoughts?" I said, "I've struggled with depression and anxiety, not paranoia." He said, "But you believe my client is orchestrating a conspiracy against you, correct?" I said, "I don't believe it's a conspiracy. I believe he violated my confidentiality and then tried to cover it up by discrediting me." He said, "You filed this complaint shortly after Dr. Reeves' book became successful. Isn't that convenient timing?" I said. "I filed it after he shared my story publicly at his book launch." He said, "But you have no proof that story was about you. You've admitted he didn't use your name." I said, "My coworker recognized it." He said, One person who you told about your suicide attempt. So really, you're the one who violated your own confidentiality, aren't you?" I felt my face get hot. He was twisting everything, making it sound like I'd caused this. The next witness was Jessica Lane. She was 34 and she had 2 kids, and she'd been Dr. Reeves' patient for 5 years. She testified that he'd written about her eating disorder in a medical journal without her permission. She said the article included specific details about her behaviors and her family dynamics and her career. She said her sister had sent her the article asking if it was about her. She said when she confronted Dr. Reeves, he'd told her she was being narcissistic for thinking the article was about her, specifically. Dr. Reeves' lawyer asked her, "Did Dr. Reeves use your name in the article?" She said, "No." He said, "Did he include your address or your employer?" She said, "No, but he included enough details that people who knew me recognized it." He said, "Or did they recognize it because you told them about your eating disorder and they made assumptions?" She started crying. She said, "He betrayed me. He took the worst parts of my life and used them for his career." The lawyer said, "You're upset because Dr. Reeves set boundaries with you, aren't you? You wanted more from the therapeutic relationship than was appropriate, and when he maintained professional distance, you felt rejected." Jessica stood up and said, "That's not true." The lawyer said, "You sent him 47 emails in 1 month after he terminated treatment. You showed up at his office unannounced. You called his personal cell phone. That's stalking behavior, Miss Lane." She left the stand crying, and her testimony was shredded. Andrew Carter testified next. He talked about hearing his addiction story at a conference. He talked about losing his job. He talked about the shame of having his coworkers know about his relapses. Dr. Reeves' lawyer destroyed him too. Pointed out that Andrew had been arrested 3 times for possession. Asked if he was currently using. Suggested that Andrew's paranoia about the conference story was probably drug-related. By the lunch break, I felt sick. We were losing. The lawyer was too good. He was making us all look unstable and vindictive. I went outside and called Emma. She said, "How's it going?" I said, "Badly. He's ripping apart every witness, making us all look crazy." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You need to go nuclear. You need something he can't explain away." I said, "I don't have anything else." She said, "Yes, you do. You told me he keeps detailed notes. You told me he documents everything. Those notes are protected during treatment, but if he's been using them for his books and articles, they become evidence of misuse. You need to get those files." I said, "How am I supposed to get his patient files?" She said, "I don't know. But if you want to win this, you need proof that he's been systematically mining patient information, not just your case, all of them." I went back inside for the afternoon session and watched 3 more witnesses get torn apart on cross-examination. The board members looked increasingly skeptical. Dr. Reeves looked increasingly confident. At 4 p.m., the board chair said they'd reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments. I drove home and sat in my apartment and thought about what Emma had said. I thought about Dr. Reeves's office with its locked filing cabinets. I thought about Diane, the receptionist who left at 5 o'clock every day. I thought about the alarm code that Dr. Reeves had never bothered to change in 3 years. I thought about how he'd told me once that he was old-fashioned about record-keeping, that he kept paper files of everything because he didn't trust digital systems. At 11 p.m., I drove to his office. The building was dark and empty. I parked around back where the security cameras didn't reach. I walked to the side entrance and used the code I'd memorized from watching him punch it in dozens of times. 1958, his birth year. The door clicked open. I stood in the dark hallway and listened. Nothing. I walked to his office and tried the door. Locked. But I remembered he kept a spare key on top of the door frame because he'd locked himself out once during a session and had to retrieve it while apologizing. I reached up and felt around and found it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside and closed it behind me. I turned on my phone flashlight and went to the filing cabinets. 4 tall cabinets against the wall, each with 5 drawers, all locked. I tried the desk drawers and found the key in the second one. I unlocked the first cabinet and started pulling files. Each patient had a folder with their name and case number. Inside were session notes, treatment plans, assessment forms, and personal notes Dr. Reeves had written to himself. I found my file first. I opened it and started reading. The notes from after my suicide attempt said, "Patient demonstrates classic manipulation tactics. Uses crisis to elicit sympathy and attention. Likely staged attempt to appear more severe than actual suicidal ideation. Recommend maintaining boundaries and not reinforcing attention-seeking behavior." I kept reading. There were notes about my medication, my family relationships, my work stress. And then there were different notes. Notes that weren't in the official format. Notes that said, "Possible case study for book chapter on manipulation." And, "Good example of attention-seeking versus genuine suicidal ideation for conference talk." He'd been planning to use my case before he ever told me. He documented his intention to exploit my trauma while he was still treating me. I pulled out my phone and started photographing pages. Then I moved to Jessica's file. Same thing. Notes about her eating disorder followed by notes about strong narrative arc for journal article, and could tie into broader discussion of control issues. I went through Andrew's file, through all 6 cases I'd brought to the hearing. Every single one had those secondary notes. Documentation of Dr. Reeves planning to use their stories before he'd even terminated treatment with them. I moved faster. I pulled files randomly. A woman who'd been sexually assaulted. Notes about trauma, followed by powerful testimony for conference on PTSD. A man who'd lost his child. Notes about grief, followed by could use for book chapter on complicated mourning. A teenager who'd been bullied. Notes about suicidal ideation, followed by good example of social media impact on adolescent mental health. He'd been doing this for years, systematically identifying patients with compelling stories and documenting his plans to use them publicly. I photographed hundreds of pages. My phone was at 20% battery when I finished. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I locked the cabinets. I replaced the key. I locked the office door and put the spare key back on the door frame. I walked out of the building and drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. I had everything. Documentation that Dr. Reeves had been planning to violate confidentiality while patients were still in active treatment. Proof that he saw patients as content to mine rather than people to help. Evidence that every word he'd said about anonymizing and compositing cases was a lie. I got home at 2 a.m. and spent the next 5 hours organizing the photos and creating a presentation. I made a spreadsheet showing patterns, patient name, date of treatment, nature of trauma, date Dr. Reeves made notes about using their story publicly, date he actually used it. The pattern was damning. He'd used intimate details from active therapy sessions in books and articles and conferences within weeks of documenting them. He'd built his entire career by exploiting the people who trusted him most. At 7 a.m., I called Susan Graham and told her I had new evidence. She said, "What kind of evidence?" I said, "His files, his actual patient files, showing he planned to use their stories before he even terminated treatment." There was a long silence, and then she said, "How did you get his patient files?" I said, "That's not important." She said, "David, if you obtained those files illegally, they can't be used in the hearing. They'll be thrown out, and you could be charged with breaking and entering." I said, "What if I anonymize the sources? What if I just present the pattern without saying where it came from?" She said, "That's still not going to work. The board needs to verify authenticity. If you can't explain how you obtained the documents, they're useless." I felt everything collapse. I'd risked everything to get those files, and now they were worthless. Susan said, "I'm sorry. I know you're trying to prove your case, but there are rules about evidence and chain of custody. We can't use stolen documents." I hung up and sat on my couch staring at the photos on my phone. I had proof that Dr. Reeves was a predator who exploited vulnerable patients, and I couldn't use it. The hearing resumed at 9 a.m. Dr. Reeves's lawyer gave his closing argument. He said the board was looking at baseless accusations from troubled individuals who couldn't accept that their treatment had ended. He said Dr. Reeves was a dedicated professional who had done nothing wrong. He said this hearing was a waste of time and resources. The board's attorney gave a weak closing about patterns of behavior and ethical concerns. It was clear he knew the case was falling apart. The board chair said they would deliberate and issue a decision within 30 days. Everyone stood to leave. Dr. Reeves walked past me with a smile and whispered, "You should have just apologized." I stood outside the hearing room and watched him shake hands with his lawyers and pose for photos with supporters who'd shown up to watch. He was going to win. He was going to keep his license and his career and his reputation, and he was going to keep exploiting patients. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel and looked at the photos on my phone. Hundreds of pages of evidence that proved everything. Evidence I couldn't use because I'd obtained it illegally. Then I thought about what Emma had said. Go nuclear. Find something he can't explain away. The hearing might have rules about evidence, but the court of public opinion didn't. I opened my laptop and created a new email account. I attached 50 of the most damning photos, patient files with Dr. Reeves' notes about planning to use their trauma publicly. I wrote a short message. Dr. Nathan Reeves has been systematically exploiting his patients for years. Here is proof. He documents plans to use their stories before terminating treatment. He sees patients as content, not people. Spread this everywhere. I sent it to every journalist who'd covered his book. I sent it to every mental health advocacy organization I could find. I sent it to the American Psychological Association. I sent it to the producers of every show he'd appeared on. Then I posted some of the photos online with patient names blacked out. I posted them on Reddit, on Twitter, on Facebook. I wrote captions explaining what people were looking at. Within an hour, the story started spreading. Within 3 hours, I was getting calls from news outlets wanting interviews. Within 6 hours, Dr. Reeves' publisher had released a statement saying they were reviewing the allegations. Within 12 hours, 3 major media outlets had published articles about the leaked documents. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. The New York Times ran a piece titled, "Best-Selling Therapist Accused of Exploiting Patient Trauma." The Washington Post interviewed 6 former patients who said they recognized their stories in Dr. Reeves' work. NPR did a segment on ethics in mental health treatment and used Dr. Reeves as a case study. His literary agent dropped him. His consulting contract with the TV show was terminated. A psychiatry conference in Boston canceled his keynote. The podcast tour was called off. His practice lost half its patients in a week, and the licensing board reopened the investigation with expanded scope. Susan called me 3 days after the leak and said, "I know you released those files. The timing is too convenient. You could be in serious legal trouble." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She said, "David, I'm trying to help you. If Dr. Reeves' lawyers can prove you broke into his office and stole patient records, you'll be facing criminal charges, breaking and entering, theft, possibly even more." I said, "Then I guess they'll have to prove it." She was quiet for a long time, and then said, "The board is reconvening next week. We're bringing additional charges based on the leaked documents. Even if we can't use them as official evidence, they've prompted new complaints from patients who recognize themselves in his notes." The new hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. This time, there were 100 people in the audience. Reporters, former patients, advocates, and people who just wanted to watch Dr. Reeves face consequences. He walked in looking 10 years older. His suit was wrinkled. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. The board chair started by acknowledging the leaked documents. She said, "While the board cannot use illegally obtained evidence in our official proceedings, the documents that have come to light have prompted 23 new complaints from former patients who have now come forward with their own allegations of confidentiality violations. We will be hearing from several of them today." The first new witness was a woman named Grace Porter. She'd been Dr. Reeves' patient 10 years ago after her husband died in a car accident. She said she'd recognized her story in one of his early journal articles. She said the article included specific details about her grief, her guilt about the argument they'd had before he left that morning, her thoughts about joining him. She said her daughter had found the article and asked if it was about Dad. Grace said she'd never filed a complaint because she didn't think anyone would believe her. But when she saw the leaked notes, she saw her case file with Dr. Reeves' annotations. Compelling narrative of complicated grief, could use for article on survivor guilt. She started crying on the stand. She said, "He listened to me talk about the worst pain of my life, and he was just taking notes for his career." Dr. Reeves' lawyer tried to discredit her, but the board shut him down. The board chair said, "We've seen enough. The pattern is clear. Dr. Reeves has been systematically using patient information for professional gain for over a decade. Whether or not specific instances violated the letter of HIPAA law, the ethical violations are undeniable." 6 more witnesses testified with similar stories. Each one had found their case in the leaked files. Each one described the moment they realized their therapist had betrayed them. By the end of the day, Dr. Reeves was sitting alone at his table. His lawyers had stopped trying to defend him. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they came back, the chair read the decision. The state licensing board finds Dr. Nathan Reeves guilty of multiple violations of professional ethics, including misuse of patient information, failure to maintain appropriate boundaries, and conduct detrimental to the profession. His license to practice psychology is hereby revoked, effective immediately. He is prohibited from practicing therapy in any form, from presenting himself as a mental health professional, and from using any patient information for any purpose. Additionally, we are referring this case to the State Attorney General for possible criminal investigation. Dr. Reeves stood up and said, "You're destroying my life over some technical violations. I helped hundreds of people. I contributed to the field. You're throwing that away because a few unstable patients can't handle the truth about their own behavior." The board chair said, "Dr. Reeves, you exploited vulnerable people who trusted you. You treated their trauma as raw material for your career. You're lucky we're only revoking your license." He walked out, and the reporters swarmed him. He pushed through them, and I saw his face for just a moment. He looked at me, and I saw rage and something else. Fear. His book was pulled from shelves the next day. His publisher canceled his contract and demanded he return his advance. The TV show scrapped the episodes he'd consulted on. Universities removed him from teaching positions. Professional organizations revoked his memberships. Within a week, every trace of his career was being systematically erased. I got a call from Rebecca Foster, the lawyer I'd consulted months earlier. She said, "Several of Dr. Reeves's former patients are planning to file civil lawsuits for damages, emotional distress, lost wages, reputational harm. They're looking for other plaintiffs. Are you interested?" I said, "Yes." The lawsuit was filed in July with 19 plaintiffs. We sued Dr. Reeves personally and his malpractice insurance carrier. The case alleged systematic exploitation, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His insurance company settled within 3 months for an undisclosed amount rather than go to trial. My portion was enough to cover 2 years of intensive therapy with a new doctor, plus compensation for the career damage I'd suffered. Jessica got enough to take a year off work and focus on recovery. Andrew used his settlement to pay for rehab and finish his degree. Grace donated hers to a nonprofit that provided free therapy to people who'd been harmed by previous therapists. Dr. Reeves declared bankruptcy in October. He lost his house, his car, his savings. I heard through Linda that he'd moved to a different state and was working at a call center. Linda had apologized to me in August. She'd sent me an email saying she'd been wrong about everything, that she'd let Dr. Reeves manipulate her perception of me, that she was sorry for how she'd treated me. I didn't respond. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. Richard Coleman called me into his office in September and said the company was promoting me to senior analyst with a 20% raise and a corner office. He said they recognized they hadn't supported me properly during a difficult time, and they wanted to make it right. I said, "Thank you," but I was already looking for jobs at other companies. I didn't want to work somewhere that had believed I was dangerous based on gossip and bias. The licensing board sent me a letter in November thanking me for my courage in coming forward. They said my complaint had exposed systemic problems in how they monitored licensed professionals. They'd implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future cases of patient exploitation. Susan Graham called to congratulate me and to say, unofficially, that she was glad someone had leaked those files, even if it wasn't legally proper. She said sometimes justice required people to break rules that were protecting the wrong people. I never admitted to breaking into Dr. Reeves' office. His lawyers tried to prove it was me, but they couldn't. The prosecutor's office investigated, but found no evidence linking me to the break-in. No fingerprints, no security footage, no witnesses. The case went cold. I went to therapy every week with Dr. Lisa Chen, who specialized in treating people who'd been harmed by previous therapists. She helped me work through the betrayal and the rage and the complicated feelings about what I'd done to bring Dr. Reeves down. She never asked me directly if I'd stolen the files, but one day, 6 months into our work together, she said, "Sometimes people have to make impossible choices between following rules and pursuing justice. Those choices have consequences. The important thing is being honest with yourself about what you did and why." I said, "What if someone broke the law to expose someone who was hurting people?" She said, "Then that person has to decide if they can live with that choice. If they believe the good they did outweighs the wrong. Only they can make that determination." I thought about it, and I realized I could live with it. I could live with breaking into Dr. Reeves' office and stealing his files and destroying his career, because he'd been destroying people for 15 years and no one had stopped him. Because the system had failed and someone had to act. Because sometimes the only way to get justice was to take it yourself. I ran into Dr. Reeves one more time. It was January, 8 months after the hearing. I was at a coffee shop near my new apartment when I saw him standing in line. He'd gained weight. His hair was grayer. He was wearing a cheap jacket and carrying a backpack that looked like it came from a thrift store. He ordered a small black coffee and counted out change to pay for it. I watched him sit down at a table by the window and pull out a laptop that was covered in stickers. He opened it and started typing. I walked over to his table and stood there until he looked up. His face went through several expressions when he recognized me. Shock, fear, anger, resignation. "David," he said quietly. I said, "What are you working on?" He glanced at his screen and closed the laptop. "Nothing, just a blog." I said, "About therapy?" He shook his head quickly. "No, I'm not allowed to write about therapy. It's part of the settlement. I write about other things now. Technology, mostly." I said, "Good." We looked at each other for a long moment. I wanted him to apologize. I wanted him to say he understood what he'd done wrong, but he just looked tired and broken and small. I turned to leave and he said, "Did you take my files?" I stopped and looked back at him. "What files?" He almost smiled. "You know what files. The ones that got leaked." "Was it you?" I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He nodded slowly. "Right. Well, whoever it was, they destroyed my life." I said, "You destroyed your own life. You spent 15 years exploiting people who trusted you. Someone just made sure everyone knew about it." He looked down at his coffee and said, "I helped people. I really did help people. That has to count for something." I said, "Maybe it would if you'd done it without violating them. But you didn't. You saw us as stories to tell, not people to heal." I walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. I never saw him again. A year later, I got an email from Jessica. She'd started a support group for people who'd been harmed by therapists who'd violated their trust. She said they met monthly, and it was helping. She asked if I wanted to join. I went to one meeting and listened to 12 people tell stories similar to mine. Therapists who'd shared their information. Therapists who'd exploited them. Therapists who'd caused more harm than healing. We talked about how to trust again, how to find good therapists, how to rebuild after betrayal. I kept going to those meetings. It helped to be around people who understood, people who'd also had to fight for justice when the system failed them, people who'd also made difficult choices about how far they were willing to go to protect others from what had happened to them. I still see Dr. Chen every week. We've worked through most of the acute trauma. Now we talk about normal things, work stress, relationship concerns, family dynamics. She's never violated my trust. She's never made me feel like a case study. She treats me as a person, not content. That's all I ever wanted. 3 years after the hearing, I got married. My wife, Kate, knows everything about what happened with Dr. Reeves. She knows about the suicide attempt, the betrayal, the break-in, the leaked files. She doesn't judge me for any of it. She says I did what I had to do to stop someone dangerous. We bought a house in a different city and I took a job at a tech company where no one knows my history. I'm just David, the data analyst who's good at his job and keeps to himself and has a happy marriage. Sometimes people at work talk about therapy and I keep quiet. Sometimes someone mentions Dr. Reeves's book and I change the subject. The book is mostly forgotten now. Used copies sell for $1 online. The reviews have been updated with context about what he did. His Wikipedia page lists the license revocation before his credentials. I sleep fine at night. I don't regret what I did. I think about the 19 people who joined the lawsuit and the dozens more who filed complaints after the truth came out. I think about how many future patients were protected because Dr. Reeves can never practice again. I think about Grace Porter's daughter who now knows her father's death wasn't used as material for a journal article. I think about Jessica who runs a support group and helps other people heal. I think about Andrew who finished his degree and has been sober for 2 years. The system failed all of us, but we didn't fail each other. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.